until everyone's able to join. Hi, everyone who's joining right now. We're just going to wait about 30 seconds until folks have a chance to join the meeting, and then we'll kick it off.
Tyler, you're going to introduce me, right?
Yes, I am, Professor Harris.
Okay.
All right, everyone, I think we're going to get started. Hi, folks. Welcome to California Law Review's 2020 Symposium, Democracy Reform for the 21st Century. This panel is called Critical Race Theory, the 2020 Election and Structural Reform. My name is Tyler Takemoto. I'm a second-year student at Berkeley Law, and my pronouns are he, him. Before I turn things over to our moderator and panelists, I'd like to let you all know that we are having a Q&A with about 30 minutes left, where you'll be able to submit questions anonymously, or you can ask them yourself. Please use the Q&A function to raise your questions. Also, this panel is being recorded, and we will share the recording on our website. Thank you all for joining us. It is my honor to introduce Professor Harris as our wonderful facilitator for this conversation. Professor Harris is the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Professor in Civil Rights and Civil Liberties at UCLA School of Law and a professor in UCLA's Department of African American Studies. She has served as faculty director for the Critical Race Studies program at UCLA Law and has been widely recognized as a groundbreaking teacher in the area of civil rights education, receiving the ACLU Foundation of Southern California's Distinguished Professor Award for Civil Rights Education. Professor Harris's work centers on the interconnections between racial theory, civil rights practice, politics, and human rights. Since joining the UCLA Law faculty in 1998, Professor Harris has continued to produce groundbreaking scholarship in the field of critical race theory, particularly engaging the issue of how racial frames shape our understanding and interpretation of significant events like Hurricane Katrina, admissions policies, and anti-discrimination law. She has also lectured widely on issues of race and equality at leading institutions here and abroad, has been a frequent contributor to various media outlets on current events and cases involving race and equality, and has served as a consultant for the MacArthur Foundation and on the board of leading academic societies, including the American Studies Association. She began her teaching career at Chicago-Kent College of Law after working for one of Chicago's leading criminal defense firms and serving as a senior legal advisor in the Chicago City Attorney's Office. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Professor Harris, to introduce our panelists and kick off the discussion.
Thank you so much, Tyler. And thanks to the organizers of the Law Review. We really appreciate the challenges in organizing this event, given the circumstances and the many changes that have been imposed, both in terms of timing as well as the context. Our panel really provides us with an opportunity to consider how race structures and is constructed in the current political moment. And of course, this is not the only panel in which race and inequality has been or will be considered as part of the symposium. I've been trying to follow the discussion earlier and note how much that has been a part of the conversation. But our panel has been called upon to give a specific consideration, a kind of critical analysis of how race and racism is being mobilized in the context of this particular moment. And so I really just want to take a few moments to situate our conversation and to introduce our really amazing panel by foregrounding a couple of things that have been on my mind as we take up this discussion. So we have had for a number of decades now a kind of national progress, racial progress narrative that has been grounded in colorblindness. But this colorblindness has been put under pressure by events. Most recently, it's been ruptured by the epic failures in addressing the two intersecting pandemics, one, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the second, the unrelenting pandemic, the long-standing pandemic of anti-Black violence. But arguably, colorblindness had really already been challenged by the 2016 election, in which we were told that a frustrated white working class, angry over their declining prospects, voted for Trump. And for nearly 4 years now, we've been subjected to a regime which has relentlessly pursued policies that are anything but colorblind, and that have enabled corporate extraction, labor exploitation, and really advanced white supremacy. So the question of the significance and meaning of race has been an ever-present issue, not surprisingly in the current election. And it's been across a range of issues, ranging from access to the vote, to the apparatus of voting, to districting, to the aftermath of Shelby counting, campaign finance, the Electoral College, you name it, as well as debates over how racial justice demands should or should not figure in strategic political decisions. This has also been a longstanding kind of debate. And we certainly could not, in the next 75 minutes, do justice to all of that. But our 4 speakers today are going to help us tease out some of these conversations. The main point of departure that I wanted to bring forward, though, is that as it would happen, as fortune would have it, I guess I would say, recently, Trump's Office of Management and Budget issued a memo that denounced the expenditure of federal, or called for the cessation of the expenditure of federal money on trainings on, quote, critical race theory, white privilege, or any other training or propaganda effort that teaches or suggests either that the United States is an inherently racist or evil country, or that any race or ethnicity is inherently racist or evil. Citing unnamed news sources, the memo asserted that federal employees have been subjected to these kinds of trainings, and they are required, in which they are required to acknowledge that, quote, virtually all whites are racist, and that they have benefited from racism, and this all contravenes basic American values. So given the fact that in the last 2 weeks, COVID-related deaths are fast approaching 200,000, and that the number of Black people killed, shot, choked, beaten by the police or their self-appointed fill-ins have continued to rise, this OMB directive to federal agencies might seem curiously tone deaf if it were not so consistent with the Trump administration's political playbook that basically invokes the same race-baiting moves over and over ad nauseum. But thinking about this, I began to wonder if there was something more at play here than simply denouncing some imagined racial diversity training run amok, and more than simply a distraction from the administration's failures. The mischaracterization of critical race theory here is more, I think, than a caricature. It's a ploy that's intended to gin up the idea that anti-racist work is itself racist, and to some extent, against whites specifically. And to some extent, this claim really reprises some of the infamous billboards, I don't know if you all recall this, that appeared on Alabama highways several years ago. They were sponsored by a white nationalist group called the White Genocide Project. And they were big billboards. I actually encountered one when I was traveling from Atlanta to Huntsville, Alabama. And I saw one, I nearly ran off the road. It said, anti-racist is a code word for anti-white. The other billboard said, diversity means chasing down the last white person. There was controversy over these billboards. They were eventually taken down. My point is simply that Trump is recycling something that's already been out there in the universe. I wanted to make the point here that this isn't just Trump. This is kind of a longstanding kind of argument about anti-racist work. So clearly this is red meat for his base, the portrayal of anti-racist ideas as extremists, stoking a sense of white grievance and victimization, so that they see themselves as the victims of diversity training, not corporate greed or capitalist plunder. But why? That still doesn't answer the question necessarily. And I want to thank you for sort of framing it this way when we first began. Why would it be that a relatively under the radar branch of legal scholarship, I mean, it's my work, so I like to think of it as being, broadly available and everybody knows about it and it's highly influential. And I don't want to understate the fact that it clearly does have influence and traction, but Still, the idea that a relatively under the radar branch of legal scholarship, critical race theory, would feature so prominently and so specifically in this attack really raises a couple of interesting questions. What is it being mobilized to do? Why CRT? What is at issue here? So our four speakers today are going to help us tease out the answer to this question and the broader implications of some of the issues that I just mentioned as we went along. And we are really, really fortunate to have some fantastic people here. The first speaker is going to be Guy-Uriel Charles. He is the Edward and Ellen Schwartzman Professor of Law at Duke Law School. And I should say, I refer you all to the bios that are available, but I just wanted to mention a couple of things that are relevant to our discussion here. He's the co-director with Mitu Gulati of the Duke Law Center on Law, Race, and Politics. He teaches and writes about constitutional law, election law, has written a number of really groundbreaking works in the area. He's a recipient of the Distinguished Teaching Award at the school, and he's been part of a National Research Commission on elections and voting, and brings that information and wealth of experience to bear. Our next speaker will be Atiba Ellis. Atiba is a professor at Marquette University Law School. He's also a leading scholar on voting rights, and his work in particular focuses on how race and class barriers to voting manifest themselves in what he calls the hyper-regulation of the right to vote. We often think about the right to vote as being sort of under-supported by law, meaning not fully supported by legal regulation, but in some people's votes are actually subjected to heightened legal scrutiny. And Atiba is bringing that to our conversation. Luis Fuentes-Rohwer is the Harry T. Ice Faculty Fellow at the Indiana University School of Law. He teaches and writes in the area of civil rights. He's also co-written a lot with Guy. And his particular emphasis also brings legal history to bear on this conversation regarding voting and access. He is an expert on constitutional law and the Reconstruction era. And his work focuses on the intersection of race and democratic theory. Our last and certainly not least speaker will be Barbara Arnwine. Barbara is legendary. She is a president and founder of the Transformative Justice Coalition. She's internationally renowned for her work on critical justice issues and was a central figure in helping to organize the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1991, which sought to correct some of the abuses, or I guess I should say backwards, decisions of the Supreme Court decision of previous terms, and the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act in 2006. She is the former head of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, and holds the title there of President Emeritus. And she's taught at North Carolina Central University as well as Columbia Law School. She's head of a number of national voting rights initiatives and programs. And I just want to say that I really want to thank you all for coming together to help us have this conversation. So with that, I'm going to turn over this question to our first speaker, Guy. What do you make of the OMB's efforts to target CRT through the call to cut off federal funding for any training that includes critical race theory?
Thank you, Cheryl. And it's a pleasure, I should add, to be on a panel moderated by the great and amazing Professor Cheryl Harris, who herself is an unbelievable legend and to whom we owe so much, not just in this area, but in the area of race and law much more broadly, and race and inequality in class. So it's my absolute pleasure to be here with my fellow panelists, but also to be under the great maestro, Cheryl Harris. So to pick up from where you left off, right, which is how should we understand the role that critical race theory is playing here? And what is the message and narrative that is being communicated? And so I'll make two very specific points. The first is to understand in some respects that this is a battle for the soul of the nation. It is a battle for how should we understand the American project and what role do people of color have in being agents in control controlling the American project. And part of what the president and his administration is reacting to, and we also have to understand, obviously, that the Republican Party is an overwhelmingly white party. So what we have is racial stratification among the two parties. The Democratic Party is largely a party of folks of color. Its core base is African American. It has a particular directive and objective in that regard. And so the president is speaking of his base, to his base, but he is also making a point about who belongs in this country, right? And so part of what critical race theory does and what it communicates, at first it tells us a descriptive and clear narrative about what happened and how law plays a subordinating role, and how law has often played a subordinating role, which is not a positive story about the birth of the nation, which is not a positive story about racial subordination, and though a realistic story about racial subordination. And part of the fight here is who gets to tell that story and what are the implications of that story. The second point that I want to make also builds from something that you said, right, which is related to the first. So there's a colorblindness narrative. And the colorblindness narrative is also related to the idea that this is a country that is ever purifying itself. That yes, perhaps there were some compromises, bad compromises at the very beginning, but really this is a country that believes in equality, that strives for equality, and you couldn't be better off than being in this particular environment. And one of the things that the colorblindness narrative tries to tell us is that, look, if we ignore race, then it essentially goes away. So this is part of the point that the Chief Justice made, right, that the best way to get over racism is fundamentally and effectively to just ignore race, right? It is a focus on race that leads to racial inequality. And so, and there's a need to believe that racial inequality, what some of us would regard as that one of the major sins of this country, and the one that continues to be with us. There's a need to believe that at best it was a problem of the past, that it is no longer a significant problem, if it ever was a significant problem, and that the real racists are those who are paying attention to race, as opposed to the ones who are struggling with the question of racial inequality. And so critical race theory obviously counters those moves in very brilliant ways, and tries to explain how racial subordination is maintained, how it is perpetuated, what is the role of history, what is the role of constitutional foundations, what is the role of economics, what is the role of capitalism, right? Various systems that we take very seriously in this country, and tries to understand the role that they play in racial subordination, and undermines the optimism narrative that is a central feature of colorblindness. So what you are seeing, as you mentioned, Cheryl, this is nothing new, right? We have long understood the role that sometimes we think of it as dog whistling, but in many cases it isn't dog whistling. It's very explicit. The role of the racial narrative plays both for a predominantly white base, right, that tries to provide people a certain belief in this country and how this country operates, and its particular, some of its economic systems, its racial systems, its judicial systems, and undermines the role that people of color are trying to play, and to show how certain aspects of our society perpetuates racial subordination, and to make make a place for themselves as agents of the narrative, right? To say we are not simply victims, we too belong here, and here's the claim that we are making of how we belong and what role that we want to play and how to expand the American framework to fully encapsulate not just one perspective, but the broad scope of the American framework. So to wrap up, I think this is part of a narrative that is fighting for the soul of the country, particularly at a time in which it seems that folks of color may be playing a greater role in the political process in deciding the future of the country. So it's an attempt both to placate a base, but also to discourage a group of incipient folks who are trying to grab and hold political power and who are trying to become agents of the future of the nation. And so it's not surprising then that race once again is being deployed in the political process. And we've seen this play over and over again.
Thank you, Guy. I really was taken with the idea that part of what's at play here is the resistance to us being agents of our own counter narrative, and the fact that who gets to tell the story is still very much contested. I also was taken with the notion that this is really a pushback against the pushback against colorblindness. That is to say, that this is a disruption of the racial progress narrative that the country likes to tell itself. And I particularly was thinking about the parallel between the kind of denialism that is inherent in what's going on and the denialism that the Trump administration and his supporters are engaging in around the COVID pandemic itself. It's like, you know, eventually it's just going to disappear, just like magic. It's just going to go away. There's a kind of really powerful parallel that I think comes from your remarks. Atiba, I'm going to pitch the same question to you and thoughts that you have about why we have CRT sort of featured in the latest version of the Trump administration's drama.
So it's interesting, and as I get started, let me just say it's an honor to be here too. I am really appreciative. And in fact, in the CRT tradition, I'm going to start briefly by telling a story about myself and sort of expressing the power of narrative and realizing my own agency, and then sort of build on some of the points that Guy has mentioned about colorblindness and the sort of the power of the rhetoric of this move, right? And so the story actually, and it's nice that I connect with Guy because I am an alum of the law school at which he teaches, and the story actually locates me in my first year of law school, where one of my professors actually gave me an article by Professor Harris. And I read it in the critical race theory tradition and realized that I not only saw myself in that article, but I saw this history about the United States. And so while being in law school and graduate school, I felt motivated by all of these themes of agency and realizing that the country is more complicated than what I would read about in my case books and that sort of thing. And as I went from law student to lawyer to now law professor, I've come to realize that, at least for me, a lot of the concerns around colorblindness, in essence, not only sort of reinforce a status quo and in a sense offer a kind of magical thinking of, if we stop talking about race, then racism will stop mattering. It also sort of reinforces structure, right? And so in one sense, thinking about how I read the Supreme Court, for example, and its long history in terms of evoking color blindness at particular points in relation to how a critique about structure of the Constitution should be read or not read. You know, it makes me think that there is both this silencing of the pushback and sort of advocating for race consciousness as a legitimate lens, but then there is also the implication of leaving the structure that was created, right, and put into place in place. And in fact, I always like to, whenever I talk about this, I always want to talk about Harlan's famous dissent in Plessy, where the color blindness as a term entered into the constitutional conversation. And of course, everyone likes to pick up on this notion our Constitution is colorblind. And certainly there's a lot of work in CRT that explores this. But as a simple textual matter, looking at that moment, I always like to think about, well, read the whole paragraph. And the whole paragraph talks about the greatness of the white race if it so chooses to do things to keep it great. And it's all there in that paragraph in Harlan. So when I teach race in the law, I say to folks, read the entire thing and think about the rhetorical interrelationship. And perhaps a similar thing is happening here today, right? This sort of pushback against critical race theory as, in a sense, straw man against which to be attacked. Because yes, it is sort of an inside baseball thing that academics know about and versions of it permeate the culture, certainly, but the details are usually talked about in and among law professors on one level or another. But the rhetoric of, oh, there is this thing about critical race theory and the propagation of notions like white privilege and the other terms we mentioned at the beginning, those things end up serving as objects that, in essence, attack the establishment and thus implicitly give validity to that establishment. You know, the entire rhetoric of this strikes me as, yeah, not only silencing the narrative, but this sort of reinforcing a status quo that is implicitly about saying the hierarchy is fine and we should not allow any kind of knowledge that would compete against the hierarchy as given. And so there is this move of, and so in this sense, it's a move about power. It is a move about power in terms of what the federal government itself and what the United States represents in the ways that Guy, you know, laid out very beautifully for us. But it's also, you know, the power and agency of the individual, because those words like being critical about race and being attacked about white supremacy, if we look into popular culture, these ideas are permeating and they are building a conversation that has led people to march in the streets, that has led debates around things like football players locking arms while singing the Negro national anthem, and all of these sorts of conversations have emerged in the popular culture. So in some ways, this is the federal government and a memo, but it is also a signal to folks that this is yet another way to attack the hierarchy. And in some ways, it's right in terms of bringing that critical consciousness to recognize that there's a counter narrative, but it's that reinforcement of the status quo that is at play as well. And in some ways, I think about this in being a meme. I've written about memes in relation to voter fraud and sort of creating a rhetorical image that is not substantive, because in a lot of ways, the way critical race theory is being talked about in these things is parody in a sense, or it is sort of a naming and a suggesting without actual engagement in the substance. And so in that way, it's a meme, and it's like your cat picture on the internet. It's substantive, it elicits a reaction, and in the most political versions of memes, they motivate people to do things. And so the reality of politics is, in some ways, this is motivating people to feel comfortable in the status quo, to see their place in the hierarchy, both in terms of this sort of not white nationalist overtones that we're talking about, as well as the placekeeping and sort of thwarting agency, hierarchy reinforcement. And the most practical outcome then is the implication of vote for whom you fit within this narrative.
Wow, thank you, Atiba. I particularly am taken with this idea of CRT as a kind of meme, because I think about, on the one hand, and this I think alluded to by both you and Guy, that while CRT has been primarily thought of as a movement inside the legal academy, in many respects, some of the ideas that have come out of CRT are both reflective of what we are seeing in certain kinds of social movement discourses, as well as being influenced by or influencing social movement discourses. So we could think about, for example, Kimberly Crenshaw's groundbreaking work around intersectionality, really seeing itself both reflecting the social movement and, in fact, influencing the social movement in terms of thinking about the whole scope of the ways in which race intersects with gender, sexual orientation, and class in terms of a different kind of social movement than, say, what we saw in earlier generations. Not to say that those issues weren't there, but foregrounding the need to consider the broad scope of the ways in which systems of power intersect and marginalize groups. And the meme idea, creating this kind of parody of critical race theory and it motivating people to do things. Actually, I was quite concerned. I saw a tweet that came from Trump, I guess it was maybe last Saturday, in which on this particular topic, on the OMB memo, in which he called for it to be, for CRT to be extinguished. And that particular kind of language, which we know he's very enamored of, is indeed not just creating a meme, but is designed to motivate people to act out of that kind of fear. The idea that, that this is a body of work that is demonizing whites is designed to really motivate people out of fear. I don't want to keep talking, but I could. I want to turn it over now to Luis and ask him. Yes, Luis.
Thank you, Cheryl. And thank you, Berkeley, California Law Review. Thank you, dear panelists. I am deeply honored to be a member of this panel and to have this conversation with you. So let me begin like Atiba. I want to go back, and I'll be as brief as I can. Like Cheryl, I could go on longer than I should. But quickly, let me go back to my law school experience like Atiba just did, because I remember vividly, I was there 3 years and at my law school. And I still remember vividly when I first began learning about things I knew very little about and thinking, and mostly in places where we looked back, places where we thought about history. And I would think to myself and to those around me, it's like, I don't get this. This is just foreign to me. Like the things we're learning are not, I mean, they're new, some of them, but some of them are just not meshing with my reality, with my life, with the way I see the world. And moving forward, now move that ahead a few years. I went to law school some time ago, and I had the same reaction when I read about the 1619 Project, which connects directly to this conversation we're having this morning, or afternoon in my case. When I first, and I saw it the first day, when I don't know why, I don't remember. When the 1619 Project came out, I thought, wow, yes, this makes sense to me. The idea that the country began not in 1787, not in even 1776, but the idea of the country itself, of the United States, is a contested idea, and that we can actually have a conversation about it. Interestingly, that memory, that reaction took me back to when I first heard about critical race theory, also in law school. Those folks, the people who were writing in critical race theory, to me and to my friends, they were like mentors. They were people we looked up to because they were saying things that we weren't seeing around us, and things, again, that made sense to us. That world I described very briefly that made no sense to me. CRT helped make sense of that world, and that was so important. So then here we are in 2020, only to find out that this thing we look up to, this thing that made sense of the world for us, is something that is nefarious or sinister. Or for the record, I just want to be clear. I do think critical race theory is worth thinking about and taking seriously. I do think privilege is real. I do not think the United States is an inherently racist or evil country. And also, I don't think any race or ethnicity is inherently evil or racist. Just to be clear with that memo, that's, as Atiba put it, kindly perhaps, so I'll be as kind as he was. That's a meme. I don't think that statement from the OMB can be taken seriously, because I don't think they meant it to be taken seriously. But in my time, and I don't have much, I am sure, I just wanted to be clear about what I mean when I talk about how we view the world, how that matters, and how who gets to do the viewing matters deeply as related to the 1619 Project. So I'm sure you've seen or heard about the backlash to the project. So as I said, when I first read it, I thought to myself, what could be wrong with saying our founding and who gets to be a part of it, or what the country, the American experiment, what that comes to mean to all of us? When do we put that moment? What marks the beginning? Only so that we can include more people, or we can include more stories, or we can include things that we best not, or shouldn't, or don't want to. So to suggest let's move it back to 1619 struck me as, I wouldn't say brilliant, but worth thinking about. And as you read the pieces that came to be the 1619 Project, I mean, surely you can quibble on facts, which is in fact, by the way, what people are doing. Many historians came back, if you read the conversation, and if you haven't, you should. Many historians came back and took offense to some facts in the 1619 Project, and fair enough. I mean, some things we can quibble about, but rest assured, what spoke about the 1619 Project, it was the fact that it's trying to reorient history, to rethink our past, to help us make sense of things that made sense in a different way before. And so now connect that to what I told you about my law school experience, right? The idea that there's some people, there's folks, right, who are leading conversations or orienting law, orienting how we view the world. The 1619 Project is seeking to destabilize that. And by the way, this is not, and this is really not a novel point, but this is not some nefarious experiment by leftist radicals. This is what we do. If well, we've done what we've always done. This is the history of Reconstruction. If you've read about the turn of the 19th century, if you've read about the Dunning School, if you've read about, in fact, if you've watched Birth of a Nation, not the one recent, but the one from 1915. That movie, I am sure if you've read about this history, you know that movie was, the history is, it was being taught at leading history departments in the country. And it took Du Bois's history in the 30s, right, to push back against that earlier history, a history that described Reconstruction as a tragic era. And then now we have a different history. And now, of course, people keep pushing back. That's what happens. Think about the monument debate we're having presently. It is a debate about how we view the past, how we understand the past, who gets to do the understanding and the viewing and the filtering of that past. I'm going to stop here with one quote, just so that you see this is not complicated. In a 2002 book, in fact, entitled Who Owns History? Eric Foner wrote, Eric Foner, Pulitzer Prize winning historian, by the way, not some other Eric Foner. He wrote, and think about what I just told you in light of this quote. There's nothing unusual or sinister in the fact that each generation rewrites history to suit its own needs, or about disagreements within the profession and among the public at large about how history should best be taught and studied. Right, so in the end, the 1619 project is not new. It's what we've always done. And really what's surprising to me is that some historians today seem surprised by that fact. Look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis. I'm really also struck by the parallel that you draw between the reaction to CRT as an earlier body of work, and just as a footnote, thank you all so much for acknowledging me as having influenced your law school career, except it makes me feel incredibly old, but that's a whole nother, story.
Your words, not mine, Cheryl. I wasn't going to say that.
But I do want to say that this question of how interventions that seek to re-narrate and tell a different story unsettle and challenge national fables, and how they engender reaction both to the substantive challenge as well as to the agents of their retelling, and that this is, situating this as a longer historical struggle is really very helpful, because I think it actually helps us understand what we're in, and understand why, on the one hand, while this seems to be a distractive move, that is to distract from the president's utter failures, he's waving this banner around, but there actually is something to what he's doing in the larger sense of a fight and a battle over the control of a narrative. And I think that balance of sort of trying to understand that is important as we go forward. I want to turn now to Barbara and ask her for her thoughts, and bringing to bear both her activist and organizing and tremendous experience in this arena. What does this move say to you, Barbara?
Well, not surprising. First of all, thanks everyone. It's a pleasure to be on this panel with all of these amazing scholars, and thank you, Cheryl. It's been a pleasure working with you in and out of UCLA, and with Professor Kimberly Crenshaw and Devin and all the other great people at UCLA. And I want to thank the University of Berkeley for this panel. A couple things, I really love what everybody's been saying. And by the way, I went to Duke. I am a Duke law grad. So we got 3 Duke connections here. I can't believe it. But in any event, and Louise, my God, you were blessed. When I went to Duke, there were no Black professors, no professors of color whatsoever. We had a couple of women, probably 2. One had a nervous breakdown in class and had to be taken by ambulance out because of the evilness of how they treated women at the school. Come on. So a lot of us have gone, through my whole history was totally different, Cheryl, so you should feel good. I had no CRT to read. I had no article for you to read. I go way back on that. So looking at this whole attack on CRT, which for me has been refreshing, the doctrine of CRT has been so refreshing, and, and making everyone look, theoretically differently at the entire, legal framework is important. But what I think we need to understand, though, is that, this is, a fight. The fight over the narrative is also because we're having a real battle over the body politic. That's what, this is where we are. I mean, we knew that as American demographics changed, that there would be a fight over the democracy. The whole, there was no, issue that this would, in fact, either, you would have to concede and transform and transition to a multiracial democracy, inclusive or you would resist it with everything in your power to maintain, white supremacy. I mean, that was always the contrast, always the battle that was, coming at us for decades now. So it's no, shock in some ways that, CRT is the latest, straw person. It's no surprise that we've seen, as Louise was saying, if you look at social media, the attacks on the 1619 Project have all been renewed as the CRT battle has come up. It's just a lot of this is horrible because, we have a resistance in our country, white. I always see this as one of, white structural racism's defensive mechanisms, for racial denial, is to always resist truth telling, any form of truth telling. And no matter what it is, Black history courses, whatever. I mean, just, the hatred of truth telling about race and the role of race in our society. So it's this administration is in many ways the result of our internal contradictions that this nation has been fighting with since its inception. And one of the things that we got to remember, why CRT, right? Why CRT? Because one thing that this administration has done, with the Steve Bannon originally, with Stephen Miller sitting there still, another Duke law person, all of these known white supremacists who have been in this administration, they have totally taken on law. I mean, the legal framework has been something that they have been just determined to reshape in their image. Everything from the judiciary and who sits on the judiciary. Look at that horrible decision out of the 11th Circuit, the Jones versus Florida decision that came out on Friday. Look at that. William Pryor, we opposed him. Every civil rights group in the world opposed him. 5 of his, majority of 6 are Trump appointees. These are people who have been forced in, who are being put onto the bench to reshape the judiciary. So it's no accident that as they're focusing on law, because remember that when we're talking about all these attacks on protesters, they've been for 10 years now, working hard to, and especially since 2014, have been working extremely hard to rewrite laws regarding your right to protest. And what, Tennessee, just passed a law saying that you can lose your right to vote if you're accused of certain kinds of crimes as a protester. So come on, this has been a real systemic, reaction that white structural racism is always going to do to maintain itself. I just wanted to also, look at, the demonization of the poor. Let's not miss that. That's been a big part of this administration. The toxic masculinity, which has unfortunately appealed to too many of men of color. These have been realities of how this administration has tried to build. But don't forget that in 2017, the FBI issued what they call the Black Identity Extremist Directive, the BIE directive. And that directive basically was in response to Black Lives Matters, and it was to demonize, Blacks who, identified as Black. Now, let me be clear. People say, what did she just say? People, the FBI actually set up a couple of training sessions where they were, quote, trying to recruit Black ministers to help them identify Black identity extremists. And one of the criteria that they espoused during these training sessions was, one, because they overly identify with Black issues, that being Black was too critical to them, was too important. That's how you could tell a Black identity extremist. I kid you not. That was one of their criteria. So when we talk about, all of this, and of course, fortunately, the Congressional Black Caucus got on the FBI good, but still, this stuff is at play. So we gotta, I see all of this in a continuum. I don't see it as unique. I see it as, just one of the things that white structural racism will continue to do. And it's the gamesmanship. And let me just end by talking about white talk. We need to recognize there's white talk in this country, that we got, quote, white immunity to COVID. That's why we can go out and hang at the beach and infect everybody, because we got white immunity. And anyway, it's white, it's genociding, it's killing all them bad people anyway, because it's killing, 3 Blacks to every 1 white, 3 Latinos for every 1 white. I mean, come on. I mean, these are the theories. This is the era that we live in. And so, this truth-telling resistance that we're going up against, because that's what CRT does. It helps us to really understand who we are as a nation. It really puts the legal framework in its proper context. That is definitely not something that they envision. They envision a domination. The only way they can resist this new democracy is to dominate the judiciary, to dominate the lawyers, to dominate the whole entire legal framework. So we gotta just be ready for what we're up against. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. I'm really thinking now about what you're saying regarding this effort to really control and reshape the law. One of the things, though, that I know from your work and from the work of actually all of the panelists is that the actual narrative about the law's protection of voting and democracy is itself one of the fables that we need to really address, which is, I take that from all of you all's work, which is that there's a contradiction between the ascendant narrative and story about the triumph of democracy and the actual longue durée of voter suppression and exclusion. I want to actually open it up for our questions now, and I invite any of you, if you have questions of each other, to put them forward. I'm going to ask Tyler if we have any questions right now that are queued up. Otherwise, we'll just keep going.
Thanks so much, Professor Harris, and thanks to all the panelists. This has been awesome so far. I'm just going to read off a question that we received for everyone on the panel. So the question is, so little about what we are experiencing now in terms of racialized politics is new. At the same time, we are seeing an inflection point and crisis around the denigration of Black and brown lives and their worth, which has put a spotlight on these issues in a way that hasn't been done for a generation. How do we capitalize on this moment to make sure that our political system recognizes, elevates, and listens to diverse voices? And what institutional changes would best protect the right for diverse representation in American politics?
If I may take a stab at that. So take 2 time periods, take the Reconstruction era, and then take the Civil Rights Movement. If you are a Black person toward the Reconstruction era, you probably have a perspective of linear progress. Of course, what you didn't know is that the political process in a short period of time would not only shift, but become extremely regressive and reduce the state of Black Americans as close as possible to that of slavery. Now you take the civil rights movement, particularly in the early 1960s, and then maybe at its height, which is symbolized by Selma, and then you take the control of the political process that culminated in two of the greatest civil rights acts that we've ever had, the 1964 Civil Rights Act and 1965 Voting Rights Act. There are a couple important differences between those two moments. One is that in the mid-60s, the Democratic Party controlled the legislative process, and so you can change social movement into legislative action, right? And the 64 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act were both important and deep structural changes, whereas Reconstruction really led to a backlash, and without control of the democratic process, without the agency of folks of color. And so what matters is, as much as possible, we have to control the legislative process, because that's the mechanism by which you change social movement into political action, into civil rights, into legislation, and then try to restructure the political process so that way you can entrench the gains of progress, right? Because otherwise that's really difficult to do.
If I may add two quick points to that answer. One, think of what Guy said, we have to control the political process. Well, the we is crucial. So think about back in Reconstruction, right? Controlling the political process wasn't, there's lots of groups within the political process vying for that control. So even within the Republican Party, right, there were factions. And so that getting the party itself to move was not as easy as we now think looking back. You see that again in 64 and 65. Like you think about the Democratic Party, the party led by Kennedy and then Lyndon Johnson, there were factions. And in fact, if you read the debates about the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in Congress, some of the most racist things were being said by people who were so-called from the Democratic Party, things that would actually get the hairs at the back of your neck spinning. And this is in the halls of Congress. So the point is, right, moving forward and entrenching gains is really hard. So hard, in fact, so hard that we even when we do it, because really the final point, even when we do it, we don't always get that which we went after. Think Reconstruction first. Those gains we ended up with were gains that we wanted, but we, of course, people of color, I would say, the freedmen, the interest of the former slaves. Those were gains that were not all that they were asking. So Frederick Douglass took what he got, but he would say, look, we wanted lots more than this. The 15th Amendment was the most conservative amendment that was put forth by the Congress amongst many of them, many different renditions. Same in 65. The freedom movement was pushing forth some really radical voting rights acts. And yet in the end, they picked, I know we think of, and I don't mean to denigrate it, we think about the Voting Rights Act as an achievement, and it was. Yet in the end, that which the freedom movement wanted was not what the freedom movement got, which is my way of saying even the wins are tempered. And of course, by 68, and the backlash, the retrenchment led to ultimately, of course, Shelby County. So my only point I took too long, but briefly to Guy's point, it's contestation happens always. Retrenchment happens. This is our history. But to the question, to be really brief, the fight never ends. Never, even after you think you've won.
I want to jump in to follow this point. I think both Guy and Luis are absolutely correct. Control of the political process and the hard work that it takes to gain that control is the way. And this contestation is so important. my little addition to that point is simply recognizing that there is the choice of media in which you can contest is so much broader than either of the periods that Guy or Luis mentioned, right? 2020 gives the advantage of allowing every one of us talking to each other now to give voice via this little device, right? And we've seen in the recent history, the power that has come through engaging through social media, through using that ability to organize. I mean, these are all very obvious points, but I think part of the power of the narrative is the effort to think that one's voice can be taken away. But I simply say we are all armed with the power to use our voice and to continue the movement. And I say we should continue to do so. Part of the distraction power of this sort of meme is to think that the counter memes have won and that we should just be quiet. We shouldn't. And that's about that sort of internal recognition and validation that our own voices, I mean, put it this way, and I don't want to go on too long about this, but in a sense, there's a lot of national gaslighting happening these days, right? A lot of sort of being told that these critical realizations that we've realized are actually something else. And the thread throughout this, one of the threads throughout this entire conversation has been that recognition that part of the narrative is trying to rewrite, part of the effort is to rewrite the narrative in a way that, in this particular sense, removes our voice. And saying that out loud is so important in order to continue pushing the advocacy.
Thank you. I'm sorry, go ahead, Barbara.
Oh, I just think that, no, there's no doubt that the Voting Rights Act of 1965, when you put it in context, the fact that it had this Section 5 mechanism to prevent discrimination before it occurred, to object to it, that's kind of, I'm sorry, I look at constitutional law internationally, and that was pretty radical. When you think about what other nations have done in their attempts to come out of the colonial era, other kind of white supremacist, modes. So, the Voting Rights Act was pretty transformational. We went from what, 1.5% registered Blacks to over, 65% in many states, 5%, et cetera, to over 70. I mean, it was pretty radical. And it was a success that led to Shelby. It's the success of the CRT probably that's leading to this particular attack, right? People, it's when we're good at stuff and when we're successful that people attack us and really take on, trying to get rid of it. The 1619 Project was too brilliant, too beautiful, and had such amazing widespread impact. Of course, it had to be attacked because of the way that our country, defends white structural racism. But I also think that probably we think too small. That we should be thinking about more instead of less. That we should, on the voting systems, I live and breathe voting rights. I live and breathe, organizing people at the local level to take political control. That's what I do, every single day. And one of the things that we have to deal with, when you look at Jones versus Florida, when you look at Shelby, you look at all these cases, is we do need to come up with a constitutional amendment that just instills and affirms the right to vote. That Jones basically, takes another page out of Bush versus Gore in that regard, and centers itself so much in the right of states to regulate their own elections and to deny people if they feel like it. But also, I think when we talk about reparations, we're not talking about it correctly. that we are only, looking at monetary, programmatic, economic restructuring, etc. But voting restructuring should be at the top. Representation, we should be thinking so differently about how we run a government that really serves a multiracial framework. And it's not what we have now. It has to be really, really restructured to achieve that goal. And I think that we're not thinking enough about trying to live within this framework, this constitutional framework, that we need one that's more adaptive and more responsive and resonates better for people of color. So, this whole Justice and Policing Act, I mean, once again, everything's DOJ. Why? Why should there not be a constitutional commission of people of color that controls the police? I mean, come on. We should think so much differently than the little box that we're in right now when it comes to representation.
Thank you. I wanted to just, before we go on to one, I think we have time for one more question. I wanted to just say that I really am moved by the idea that we have to look at these things in terms of the historical cycle of radical demands, partial and somewhat really important reforms, and then actually how those themselves get challenged, and our fight often to restore what we won through a partial victory sometimes can consume our imagination and not allow us to think about the deeper structural changes. What would it mean, for example, if we actually had universal suffrage? What would it mean if we actually took control of the election apparatus away from the partisan electoral system that we currently have? Why should it be that the question of voting changes so radically from state to state in a society where we are very, very mobile? Why should it not be the case that there is, in fact, a fundamental constitutional right to vote? I mean, you all are the ones that have taught me that despite all of this litigation and all of this work, this is still not guaranteed. And so I think we have a template for our radical imagination that is, in fact, being resisted through these kinds of demonizing discourses. And my final point on this is the way in which the censoring of CRT is consistent with this ideology of colorblindness, it seems to me is not only an attempt to feed the base, but is also exploiting a kind of liberal unease with radical transformation, a kind of liberal unease with the idea that taking account of race is problematic, meaning that not just conservatives, but some very well-meaning liberals find it very difficult to think about radical transformative change that centers race. And so that while they would reject Trump's kind of retrograde, explicitly racist discourse, it's tapping into his arguments are tapping into a kind of concern about racial extremism, like Barbara was saying, the Black identity extremist. And so it actually is designed to incentivize a kind of racial distancing, a kind of call for denouncing this extremism by, quote, reasonable people on both sides. So then you get a kind of push for the Democratic Party to disavow these ideas. As Luis was saying, the caricature of this idea that CRT is about the notion that all whites are evil, that this is indeed part of the move. So I really appreciate you all's comments, and I know I've gone over myself, but
Cheryl,
I think we have time for.
Can I just build on that? Because I think this is so important, that at the risk of time. So, right, the point is racial progress is contingent It is transformative, but narrow. It's transformative because of the extent of racial inequality, but it is also narrow and not what movements are looking for. And then we end up fighting over the narrow space as a consequence, because we're worried, not right, precisely on the point that you're making, from the liberal framework and liberal imagination as to what transformation might take. So instead of then fighting about transformation, we're trying to hold on to what the narrow gains that we made, right? And I think it's so critical for people to account for what really, in some senses, is a framework about how racial change and racial progress happens in this country and in this context. And sorry to I just thought that was so important to build on.
Still muted. Thank you, Guy. Okay, Tyler, can we take one more question?
Yes, Professor Harris, I'll choose a brief one so that we can fit it hopefully into the next couple minutes. This question is aimed at the panel. For those, as a piece of advice for law students now trying to do racial justice work and study critical race theory, but still feeling like it isn't integrated enough into the curriculum, how can students organize to help change that?
Well, I'll take a stab at that. There have been many histories of the creation of critical race theory. Not surprisingly, their history is contested in this arena as well. But one of the things that I think comes out of many of the histories of critical race theory, and I actually wrote a little piece some time ago about the creation of the critical race studies program here at UCLA, which itself is a contested story. One of the things that I think I take away from all of these historical accounts is the way in which they were generated out of conflict. That is to say, these ideas didn't just come about because people were sitting around, as Louise said, sitting around in their classes feeling fine. They were sitting around in their classes and feeling disconnected and like this was telling a story that was not legible, not consistent with the realities. And so I guess I would say that what my understanding is that many of the stories came out of student activism. That is, they came out of the idea that students were resisting the hegemonic way in which law was being taught and the ways in which it was completely disconnected from, or significantly disconnected from, the issues and the realities that they were experiencing. And I think that finding the traction with your fellow students begins with grounding it in the struggle within your institutions and the communities where you are. And beginning to work together and kind of study together. If many of the accounts of CRT talk about people actually gathering together and looking at what was missing from the materials that they were being taught and seeking it out. We have tremendous power, even though I know law school is all about hierarchy. I mean, it's very much ingrained into the institution, and the pedagogical approach that we take is often infantilizing. I think that the reality is that we recognize the transformative possibilities of law when we in self don't just wait, as Barbara says, for some authority to appoint people on the federal bench that tell us what the law means, but that we actually, through our own practices with each other, begin to develop a kind of analysis about, well, why is this decision this way? As something as simple as a study group, something as simple as a reading group, and connecting it to something that is happening in the very institution in which you're in, or in the community in which it is located, even more crucially, is in fact a way to begin to build the kind of groundwork and relationships with others that can actually push for the adoption of a recognition of this mode of analysis as a valid and central question, because I think each and every institution is now confronted with this issue. What does it mean to be an anti-racist law school? I don't know all of the answer to that question. I don't know the answer for every single law school. Many of us are situated differently. But I think that beginning there and beginning with the power that you have as students, even though I know very often you feel disempowered, if you actually look at the stories of the histories of critical race theory, they come out of student struggles. So I'm not saying to you that, you know, that in and of itself is going to be an easy project or a quick project, but it is one that I think we all have to dedicate ourselves to.
And Cheryl, before I get off, because I have a hard stop, I'm sorry. But I, you know, as somebody who sat in and took over buildings and did all that stuff to, you know, force Black studies on campuses, to force, you know, all kinds of change. As somebody, you know, who has been there, I want to say to the students, believe in your power. Your schools can't function without your tuition. You have incredible power that you have to believe that you can exercise to force change, and that you know, change does not happen in and of itself. It never does. The inertia in our society is always towards the status quo. If you want to make change, you have to actively intervene. You have to actively make demands, and that means you have to make a whole lot of people uncomfortable, and that should be your job, is to make those kind of demands. I'm not, so, you know, obviously I'm not trying to get a teaching position. So I can say this, you know, because I don't, you know, that's just not my world, you know, totally. But I do think students have a lot of power. And remember, you can also run your own tracks. You know, I love what I've seen students doing at many of the law schools, where they literally run their own programs repeatedly, their own seminars weekly. There's a lot of good learning that can be done, but demand your school make the changes. CRT is not going to go away because Trump's mad. You know, it's, you know, fortunately, but it will go away if we concede the space. And if we say that we can't fight to maintain it, or we can't move beyond it. Because I mean, because my whole thing is blow up every box, blow up every box, because we should not be boxed in. We need to always look at how do we expand, how do we become more powerful, more you know, dominant, more multi-represented. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you all. Tyler, I think we're probably over a little bit. So I just want to sign off by saying this has been a great Monday morning. Monday mornings are not my favorite, but this has been one of the best I've had in quite a while. And I hope for the panelists, other panelists and the attendees, it's been a good way to start. We have so much that we could say more, but I really want to extend my appreciation to the Law Review and to each of you for bringing us together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Harris. Yes, this brings us to the end of the panel, but I'd just like to thank all of our panelists from the bottom of my heart. I'm so grateful to all of the attendees for showing up and engaging in this incredible conversation. So we'd like to invite you to visit bit.ly/CLR Symposium 2020 to learn about and register for more panels, and continue to follow the conversation on social media at #CLR Democracy Reform. So just echoing a heartfelt congratulations to all for engaging in this awesome conversation. And thank you so much. I feel lucky to have heard it.
Thank you.
Great. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.